If you've made it this far into this journey through the corridors of power, then you're probably as unsettled as I am. The deeper we've gone, the clearer it's become. America stands at a crossroads. Has the United States gone so far down this path of corporate control, political manipulation, and public disillusionment that it can't turn back? That's a hard question to answer, because if we begin to believe there's no hope for democracy in America, then democracy has already died. The moment we the people lose trust in this grand democratic experiment, this fragile system built on participation and accountability, we lose the very foundation of what it means to be the democratic leader of the world. And maybe that's exactly what the powers that be want. A disengaged public, a cynical electorate, a nation that no longer believes it has a voice. But despite all of this, there are still signs of hope. In the 2020 election, over 150 million Americans went out to vote. That's nearly 67% of the U.S. voting age population, according to the United States Census Bureau. That doesn't sound like a nation that's given up. Even amid accusations of fraud, misinformation, and polarization, millions still stood in line, determined to have a say in their country's future. And in the 2018 midterm elections, more than 51% of voting-age citizens participated, one of the highest midterm turnouts in decades, according to the Pew Research Center. But even with those record numbers, America still ranks 31st out of 50 among major democracies in voter turnout, behind nations like Mexico, France, South Korea, and the Philippines. So, while Americans may celebrate democracy, our participation tells another story. And that's not to say the process hasn't been made harder. According to Aaron Mendelson of the Center for Public Integrity, these efforts have disproportionately affected lower-income and minority voters, citizens who already face barriers to the ballot box. Still, roughly 80 million Americans chose not to vote in 2020. According to an NPR poll conducted by Domenico Montanaro, their reasons varied. 10% said they were undecided, 16% felt their vote wouldn't make a difference, 20% didn't like any candidate, 23% had no interest in politics, and 29% weren't even registered. Many felt alienated, detached from politics, from the news, and from their communities. And perhaps most revealingly, 80% of non-voters and 73% of voters said they didn't believe politicians actually care about ordinary Americans. When asked if mainstream media cared more about truth or profit, 72% of voters and 80% of non-voters said money came first. Even on the economy, 78% of non-voters and 69% of voters agreed. The system is rigged to benefit the rich and powerful. The irony? Many of those who do vote continue to choose between the same two parties that have long made them feel invisible. If democracy is to survive, we must recognize that trust is the oxygen that keeps it alive. Without trust, in elections, in institutions, in ourselves, democracy suffocates. And one of the most critical ways to restore that trust is through regulation. Take gun laws, for instance. After the devastating mass shooting in Uvalde, Texas, there was a national push to enforce the gun regulations already on the books. But as Tal Kopan reported for CNN, Congress soon cut funding for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the very agency responsible for enforcing those laws. Experts called these laws toothless, vague, and intentionally watered down. In fact, 85% of all federal gun prosecutions came from just two statutes: possession of a firearm by a felon and possession of a firearm while committing another federal crime. That left roughly 20 other gun laws virtually unenforced. The same negligence plays out in the financial sector. The U.S. financial system is governed by a patchwork of agencies: the OCC, FDIC, Federal Reserve, and NCUA for banks, the SEC and CFTC for securities, the FHFA and FCA for housing and agriculture, and the CFPB for consumer protection. But as we've seen, regulation is only as strong as the will to enforce it. When the Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank collapsed in 2023, analysts pointed to the Trump administration's rollback of the Dodd-Frank Act, a deregulatory effort led by Senator Mike Crapo, then chair of the Senate Banking Committee. Instead of repealing Dodd-Frank entirely, Crapo strategically weakened key provisions, claiming to help small community banks. In reality, the beneficiaries were large regional and national banks, the same institutions whose risky practices triggered the 2008 financial crisis. Lobbyists framed deregulation as relief for small-town America. But behind the scenes, corporate lobbying armies flooded Washington, reshaping policy in favor of the very few. So where does that leave us? At the edge of a political fissure, staring down a choice between apathy and action, between cynicism and courage. The truth is, democracy doesn't die in one dramatic collapse. It erodes, slowly, when people stop believing they can make a difference. But they can, and they must. Because the moment we the people decide to reclaim democracy is the moment the powers that be start to lose control of it. If we can restore faith, even just a spark, in this democratic process, then there's still hope for the American experiment. Because democracy doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to all of us. When we talk about influence in Washington, we often think of corporate lobbyists, campaign donors, and think tanks whispering in political ears. But sometimes it's much simpler than that. It's about access. Take Democratic Senator Jon Tester of Montana. Between lobbyists, executives, and banking representatives, Tester met with Montana banking officials 32 different times over revisions to the Dodd-Frank Act. If that name sounds familiar, it should. We met Tester earlier in this story. The senator who, in 2018, accepted over $1 million from the financial lobby. One can only wonder how much of that came from the very banking officials sitting across his table. Meanwhile, Senator Mike Crapo of Idaho, architect of the Dodd-Frank rollback, played to the heartstrings of small-town America. He framed deregulation as a crusade to free community banks and credit unions buried under mountains of red tape. But like most political architecture in Washington, beneath the facade of small-town advocacy lay structural advantages for the nation's largest banks. Before the revisions, any financial institution with $50 billion or more in assets had to undergo regulatory stress tests, evaluations meant to ensure solvency during a financial crisis. After the new bill, that threshold was raised to $250 billion, meaning only 12 of the largest U.S. banks remained under the Dodd-Frank stress test requirement. The rest, including Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, were now free from that critical oversight. In 2018, lobbyists representing Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank swarmed Capitol Hill, meeting with senators to advocate for the passage of the newly revised Dodd-Frank bill. When some lawmakers raised concerns about weakening financial safeguards, Senator Heidi Heitkamp dismissed those objections as diatribe, hyperbole, and overstatement. Around the same time, Senator Tester met privately with executives from Bank of America, Citigroup, Discover, and Wells Fargo, all working through the American Bankers Association. Shortly after the bill's passage, the ABA ran a $125,000 ad campaign publicly, thanking Tester for his bipartisan leadership. Tester also met with Greg Becker, the CEO of Silicon Valley Bank, who was lobbying Congress for lighter regulation with the help of the Franklin Square Group, SVB's hired lobbying firm. SVB would later donate $10,800 to Tester's campaign. And they weren't the only ones showing gratitude. Americans for Prosperity, a political network funded by the Koch brothers, released their own ads thanking Senator Heidi Heitkamp, praising her courage for standing against her Democratic colleagues. The results of these deregulations were telling. 4 years after the bill passed, the law supposedly written to protect small banks, the number of large banks rose by 6.3%, while 14% of smaller banks disappeared entirely. Those that remained saw domestic deposits drop by 6.3% and banking assets fall by 2.7%. Why? Because large institutions could absorb regulatory costs with ease, economies of scale that small-town lenders simply couldn't match. The cycle of consolidation continued. Fewer banks, more power, and deeper entrenchment for those already at the top. But the failure to enforce regulation doesn't stop with Wall Street. It extends to the very agencies tasked with protecting American lives, like the Food and Drug Administration. For years, the FDA has been slow to act on food safety crises, often allowing Salmonella and E. coli outbreaks to circulate through grocery stores for months before issuing recalls. Even more alarming, as of 2022, the FDA had failed for 11 years to implement required clean water standards, despite knowing contaminated water sources were a leading cause of foodborne illness. Insiders describe food regulation as a low priority within the agency, which tends to focus on pharmaceuticals instead. After all, most FDA commissioners come from medical backgrounds, not food safety. Some staff even joke that the F in FDA is silent, calling it simply the Drug Administration. But the consequences are no laughing matter. Each year, 128,000 Americans are hospitalized from foodborne illness, and 3,000 die. The most at risk? Seniors, children, pregnant women, and those with weakened immune systems. And the total number of Americans affected, an estimated 48 million people every year. The economic cost of these preventable illnesses, in healthcare, lost wages, and productivity, surpasses $15 billion annually. Negligence doesn't just cost money, it costs lives. And then there's the Environmental Protection Agency, an institution meant to defend environmental justice, or EJ. The EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, in the enforcement of environmental laws. But Executive Order 12898, issued under the Clinton administration, left the EPA without jurisdiction to mandate real remedies. So while the agency coordinates with offices like the Office of Environmental Justice and the Office of General Counsel's External Civil Rights Compliance Office, it remains largely powerless to enforce change. The result? Black Americans face 38% greater exposure to pollutants than white Americans, and 75% more minority communities endure noise, odor, traffic, and toxic emissions from industrial facilities. All this, despite the EPA's $83 billion budget in 2023, with over $9 billion in obligations spread across grants, programs, and environmental cleanup funds. Money isn't the issue, priorities are. From banks to the FDA to the EPA, a pattern emerges. Not one of incompetence, but of neglect. Neglect born from political convenience, corporate pressure, and regulatory capture. When oversight becomes optional, when money shapes enforcement, and when public health takes a backseat to profit, democracy itself is placed at risk. Regulation isn't just about laws. It's about protection of people, of communities, and of trust. And the moment we stop holding power accountable is the moment power stops being accountable to us. The Environmental Protection Agency's 2023 financial records tell a revealing story. Out of more than $9 billion in financial obligations, the agency dedicated just $700,000 to the Damage Assessment and Restoration Revolving Fund, and roughly $2 million to the Leaking Underground Storage Tank Trust Fund. When you look closely at these allocations, one pattern becomes clear. Many of these funds are not proactive investments in prevention, but rather payments for environmental disasters that could have been avoided altogether with proper regulatory oversight. If there's one major step we could take toward reclaiming our democracy, it would be to eradicate the corporate lobby altogether. Of course, that's easier said than done. The American people don't hold the power to make such sweeping change in isolation, but we can pressure our representatives to take action. Because make no mistake, the corporate lobby has become a mechanism of financial extortion, shaping laws and dismantling regulations meant to protect the public. We've already seen this play out in the rollback of Dodd-Frank. Corporations poured hundreds of lobbyists and millions of dollars into Washington, working to dismantle the very safeguards that were designed to prevent another financial crisis. And they succeeded. The central regulatory teeth of Dodd-Frank were pulled, replaced with loopholes that favored the very institutions that caused the 2008 collapse. But the problem doesn't end with campaign money. Corporations don't just influence politics, they intimidate it. They hire former members of Congress to lobby their old colleagues. They use political intimidation as leverage to gain compliance. These groups gather intelligence on opposition movements, monitoring which politicians or regulators might resist their agendas. This information allows them to neutralize backlash, dilute public criticism, and bypass oversight entirely. By shaping the narrative early, they minimize political hostilities and create what legal scholars call a political impression, a precedent that discourages future regulators from challenging corporate power. The deeper these interests embed themselves, the less Washington resembles a representative democracy and the more it looks like a corporate fiefdom. Consider the late 1990s, when the Department of Justice sued Microsoft for violating antitrust laws. Microsoft responded not just with lawyers, but with a massive surge in lobbying of the DOJ itself. This was more than a legal defense. It was a message, a line in the sand, showing how far Microsoft would go to fight regulatory authority. Even after losing the Sherman antitrust case, Microsoft's investment paid off in another way. Studies found that companies investing heavily in lobbying were significantly less likely to face investigation from agencies like the SEC or IRS. The more you invest in lobbying, the less likely you are to be held accountable. That's not democracy. That's a protection racket. If you think this kind of duplicity only lives in politics, think again. In 2021, Royal Dutch Shell proudly announced major investments in renewable energy and electric charging infrastructure, touting themselves as partners in the green revolution. But on that very same day, Shell filed another report disclosing its largest political donation to none other than the American Petroleum Institute, or API, the lobbying powerhouse that represents big oil's interests in Washington. The amount? $10 million in a single year. And the head of that organization, Mike Summers, has been one of the most vocal opponents of President Biden's environmental policies, including funding for the exact same charging stations Shell publicly championed. So, what's the truth? It's a familiar game, a public performance of progress backed by private investment in the status quo. A corporate sleight of hand practiced so often that it's practically muscle memory. It's a tactic we've seen before from politicians and corporations alike. They speak the language of reform while investing millions to undermine it behind the scenes. A facade of "I'm here for the people," masking an agenda built entirely on self-preservation and profit. Until the cycle of corporate lobbying, political intimidation, and regulatory capture is broken, the system will continue to serve itself, while the people it's meant to protect pay the price. Corporate power thrives not because democracy failed, but because democracy was bought. We, the American people, are the only ones capable of enforcing the changes necessary to save our democracy. And when I say we, I'm not talking about Washington insiders or political strategists. I'm talking about ordinary Americans, the civilians. Whether you wear a uniform, work behind a desk, or stand behind a counter, the line is the same. If you don't have political connections, you are the citizen this system was meant to serve. But here's the truth. For 50 years, that line between the corporate world and the political world has blurred beyond recognition. Politicians float between boardrooms and congressional seats, each transition tightening the knot of dependency between money and policy. If America is to have a chance, that tether must be cut clean. Because when the ear of a politician belongs to a corporation, it no longer belongs to the people. Let's put it this way. Imagine politics as a radio contest. You know the ones. You can't win if you work at the station, and neither can your family. Why? Because it's a conflict of interest. So why doesn't the same rule apply to Washington? No one with strong corporate ties should be allowed to enter politics. Period. If you've served as a corporate attorney, board member, or CEO of a major corporation, your career has already built a network of influence that can be weaponized the moment you take office. This conflict of interest is the same one that poisoned our democracy over a century ago, when railroad monopolies blurred the boundaries between private wealth and public office. It's the same influence that gave rise to corporate personhood in Santa Clara County v. Southern Pacific Railroad, 1886, a decision that laid the groundwork for Citizens United more than a century later. A corruption so old, it's become tradition. Here's an idea. One career path, one direction. If someone chooses to enter politics, city, county, state, or federal, they stay there. They can move upward within that sphere, sure, from governor to senator, from senator to president. But once they retire, that's it. No going back into government, no consulting, no revolving door. Because every rotation through that door brings new insider knowledge, new leverage, and new ways to exploit the system. If their professional expertise overlaps with government service, say a former banker serving on a finance committee and they're found to be using that inside information for private benefit, that should be a felony, plain and simple. No lobbying dinners, no earmarks buried in bills. In fact, reinstate the moratorium on earmarks altogether. No more CEOs of Fortune 500 companies whispering into the ears of lawmakers while drafting the very laws that will protect their profits. Because when financial executives write financial policy, when energy CEOs shape energy law, and when lobbyists edit regulation, Washington becomes not a democracy, but a corporation with elected shareholders. And like any corporation, it exists only to protect itself. Keeping individuals with such deep corporate allegiances in Washington creates an iron triangle of influence, one that's larger, stronger, and more impenetrable than ever. Inside this triangle, politicians protect one another. The few who try to challenge it are drowned out, labeled as unrealistic or out of touch. Because in Washington, the only thing most elected officials truly care about is the next election. And as long as their colleagues share that mindset, there's no incentive to change the status quo. Why would they? It's working for them. This is why term limits are no longer a suggestion. They're a necessity. No one should serve in Washington for 20, 30, or 40 years. Lifetime appointments and endless re-elections don't just breed complacency, they breed corruption. And when you look at the Supreme Court's lifetime appointments, the pattern is clear. America's democratic experiment has slowly taken on the monarchical habits it once revolted against. Just look at the age and tenure of our congressional leadership. Grace Napolitano, age 86, serving since 1999. Bill Pascrell, also 86, since 1997. Hal Rogers, 85, elected in 1981, 42 years in office. Maxine Waters, 85, serving since 1991. Steny Hoyer, 83, elected in 1981. And yes, Nancy Pelosi, 83, in office since 1987. Who just recently announced her retirement. In the Senate, the pattern continues. Dianne Feinstein, 89, elected in 1992, who has, since creating this video, retired from her position. Senator Chuck Grassley, 89, in office since 1981. Bernie Sanders, 81, a combined 32 years in federal politics. Mitch McConnell, 81, since 1985. These individuals argue that their longevity is proof of public trust, and to a degree, they're right. Voters re-elect them again and again. But longevity doesn't equal progress, because despite all these decades of experience, nothing fundamentally changes. We're still dependent on fossil fuels. We're still watching lobbyists write our laws. And the same industries that shaped policy in the 1970s still shape it today. Progress has stalled not because we lack innovation, but because those who profit from stagnation have no reason to move forward. As long as the same faces, the same families, and the same fortunes remain in charge, the results will never change. And the American people will keep waiting for change that will never come. Power is not meant to be inherited. It is meant to be shared. There's another reform we, the American people, must demand. Transparency. Not the buzzword kind, the real kind. Especially from the bureaucratic agencies that operate under the radar of democracy. Agencies like the Department of Defense. For years, the Pentagon has failed its own audits. Year after year. And each time it does, it isn't punished. It's rewarded with a bigger budget. Billions of taxpayer dollars vanish into classified corners, unaccounted for, untraceable. Yes, some of that money funds secret projects and national security initiatives, but should classified be an excuse for unaccountability? When the Pentagon can't tell us where our money is going, the risk in secrecy has outgrown its potential reward. Every dollar lost to waste, corruption, or incompetence is a dollar stolen from American families, education, and infrastructure. This pattern isn't isolated to defense. At the National Institutes of Health, scientists have received royalty payments for helping to develop drugs that are then sold through private companies. A clear conflict of interest, especially when those same leaders help craft public health policy promoting those very drugs. During the COVID-19 pandemic, pharmaceutical corporations raked in $100 billion in revenue, generating $40 billion in profit. Royalty checks, profits, and influence, all flowing through a pipeline that connects government to private industry. Even former FBI Director Robert Mueller once described the Iron Triangle as a relationship between organized criminals, corrupt politicians, and business leaders. But notice how he didn't call those business leaders corrupt. A slip of the tongue? Or a quiet admission that in America, corruption wears a suit and sits on a board of directors? One of the boldest acts an American can take today isn't violent revolution. It's something far more radical: to put real faith in the third-party system. For over a century, America has been chained to a two-party monopoly. Democrats and Republicans, two sides of the same coin. A coin minted not in democracy, but in corporate interest. Their illusion of opposition is what keeps the machine running. An endless rivalry that makes Yankees versus Red Sox look like a friendly scrimmage. While Americans argue on social media about party loyalty, politicians from both sides quietly collaborate behind closed doors, protecting their donors, preserving their careers, and paving the road for their futures. This isn't democracy, it's a trust of old. The only way to dismantle it is to open the field. When enough people break free of that fear, when new parties begin to appear on ballots nationwide, then, and only then, will Washington begin to shake in its boots. And that's when real reform begins, when new blood enters the halls of power without allegiance to the old donors, the old lobbyists, or the old lies. A new generation of leadership could focus on real issues, the ones the two-party system continues to ignore. 28 million Americans with untreated mental illness, a 350-to-1 ratio of citizens to mental health providers, a wealth gap so grotesque that the top 1% has doubled their earnings since 1979, while the bottom 90% saw only a 24% increase. Both parties share the blame. Both built this reality. Even Democrats, the so-called stewards of environmental protection, presided over the largest oil booms in U.S. history. Under Obama's second term, 2.5 million barrels per day. Under Biden, 12.8 million barrels per day. So when the party that claims to fight climate change drills more oil than any administration before it, what does that tell you? Meanwhile, America's coasts are battered by hurricanes, its deserts by deadly heat, and its forests by wildfires. The planet itself is giving us feedback, but the politicians are still cashing campaign checks. The duopoly has become an invasive species, crabgrass choking the garden of democracy. It's time to weed it out. But we don't fight this by burning it down. We fight it by voting it out. Violence isn't revolution, it's regression. The last civil war killed 620,000 Americans. If that same war happened today, scaled to our population, the death toll would exceed 6 million. With modern weapons, possibly 100 million. That's not a solution. That's annihilation. We must be strong enough, mature enough to reform through the tools democracy already gives us. Start small. Send an email to your representative. Call their office. Remind them that your vote is your weapon. If they fail you, fire them. Replace them with someone new. And if the new ones fail, fire them too. That's the process of democracy. That's the living spirit of the Constitution. This isn't just about policy, it's about moral stewardship. A government's true test, as Hubert Humphrey said, is how it treats those in the dawn of life, the children, those in the twilight of life, the elderly, and those in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped. So what does that say about us today? Our leaders have forgotten humility. They have forgotten empathy. They have forgotten that the purpose of power is not to dominate, but to serve. As Lao Tzu wrote, a leader is best when people barely know he exists. When his work is done, his aim fulfilled, they will say, "We did it ourselves." It's time we reclaim that spirit, because democracy doesn't die in darkness, it dies in apathy. And the cure for apathy is action. We the people are the firewall of democracy. If you want to take action, here are the resources to contact. Question Politics. U.S. House of Representatives. U.S. Senate Congressional Institute. If you've enjoyed this video, please click the like and subscribe buttons. If you would like to get your own copy of Corporatitions and Revolving Doors of Power, please search Amazon Books, Barnes & Noble's online bookstore, or visit clevelandkelly.com. That's KELLY.com. Thank you so much for sharing your time and watching this book series. Please keep an eye out for the next enlightening series from Cleveland Kelly. Thanks again for sharing your valuable time.